What if I told you the White House had its own drug problem before Nixon declared the war on drugs? Presidential physicians documenting daily morphine doses and sealed records. Cabinet members settling poker debts with federal appointments. A medical cover-up machine operating for 2 centuries, protecting commanders-in-chief from Congress, the press, and the American people they swore to serve. If you're here for forgotten history the textbook skipped, hit subscribe, we're just getting started. Get comfortable, pour something warm, settle in for the night. By March 1869, the Executive Mansion's medical wing had developed protocols that would shape American power for the next century. Dr. Robert Stone carried his black leather physician's bag through the East Room each morning, past portraits of Washington and Jefferson, into the private quarters where the real work of protecting presidential image began. The bag itself was unremarkable, standard medical equipment for the era. Morphine vials and laudanum bottles nestled beside bandages and surgical instruments. What made it extraordinary was the understanding that surrounded it. Stone wasn't just treating ailments, he was managing secrets. The arrangement had emerged quietly during wartime, when battlefield injuries left commanders dependent on opium derivatives that doctors prescribed freely and newspapers politely ignored. Nobody questioned a general's need for pain management. The morphine that dulled a shrapnel wound also dulled anxiety, sharpened focus, and made 18-hour command decisions feel manageable. By the time these generals became presidents, the dependency had become routine. The physician's bag followed them to Washington, its contents transformed from battlefield necessity to political liability. Stone understood his role extended far beyond medical care. He kept 2 sets of records, the official medical log that documented minor complaints and seasonal ailments, and a private ledger that tracked the actual prescriptions. The official record showed a healthy president managing the ordinary demands of office. The private ledger told a different story, one that would remain sealed in family archives until the 1980s, when historians finally gained access to presidential medical files and discovered the daily morphine doses that kept Grant functioning through 8 years of scandals, economic collapse, and a presidency that history would remember as troubled, but never as medically compromised. The protection extended beyond the physician's discretion. Party operatives like James Blaine had perfected what they called the gentleman's agreement with newspaper publishers, a mutual understanding that certain presidential matters remained private. Not official secrets that might threaten national security, but personal vulnerabilities that might threaten political stability. A president's health fell firmly in the latter category. Blaine worked the newspaper offices with the same careful attention Stone brought to medical consultations, reminding editors that America needed confidence in its leadership, especially during Reconstruction's chaos. The agreement wasn't written down. It didn't need to be. Publishers understood that access to the White House depended on discretion. Reporters who respected the boundary received invitations to state dinners and off-the-record briefings. Those who didn't found themselves frozen out, their questions ignored during press availabilities, their requests for interviews perpetually delayed. The system worked because everyone benefited from it. The president maintained his public image. The party avoided scandal. The press retained access to power, and the American people remained blissfully unaware that their commander-in-chief required pharmaceutical assistance to function. Stone's predecessor had established the foundation during the Civil War, when battlefield medicine met presidential authority. The wartime physician had learned that treating a president meant protecting him from exposure as much as from illness. Pain management wasn't just about comfort, it was about maintaining the appearance of strength when the nation needed to believe its leaders were invincible. The drugs that made this possible carried risks everyone understood, but nobody acknowledged. Dependency wasn't discussed. Withdrawal wasn't contemplated. The daily doses simply continued, year after year, normalized into routine. The medical wing itself reflected this dual purpose. The examination room contained standard equipment, stethoscope, thermometer, blood pressure cuff. But the locked cabinet in the corner held the real tools of presidential medicine: morphine sulfate, laudanum tincture, and later, as pharmaceutical science advanced, increasingly sophisticated preparations that promised better results with fewer visible side effects. Stone kept the only key. Even the president's personal secretary couldn't access those shelves. The separation between public health and private dependency had to be absolute. By the time Grant's second term ended in 1877, the protection machinery had become institutional. The next president's physician inherited not just the medical equipment, but the entire apparatus of discretion. The black bag passed from doctor to doctor, each one understanding that his primary responsibility wasn't healing, but concealment. The morphine prescriptions continued, the private ledgers accumulated, and the gentleman's agreement with the press held firm. America's presidents presented themselves as vigorous leaders while privately depending on chemical assistance that would have destroyed their careers if exposed. The contradiction didn't trouble the men who maintained it. They saw themselves as patriots protecting national stability, not enablers facilitating dependency. The distinction mattered to them, even if the practical result was identical. Stone's memoirs, published decades after his death, described his work with pride. He'd served his country by serving as president, ensuring that personal weakness never undermined public confidence. The fact that this service required systematic deception struck him as a reasonable price for political continuity. The system worked because everyone involved had incentive to maintain it. Party operatives needed their president functional. Physicians needed their patients protected. Publishers needed their access preserved. And presidents needed their dependencies private. The morphine doses that made everything possible remained invisible, documented only in records that wouldn't surface for another century. By then, the pattern Stone established had become so deeply embedded in presidential medicine that later generations would struggle to imagine an alternative. But addiction was just the warm-up act. The protection machinery Stone and Blaine perfected would soon expand to cover vices far more complicated than pharmaceutical dependency. The black medical bag became a symbol of institutional discretion, a reminder that presidential image required constant maintenance, and that the gap between public virtue and private reality could be managed indefinitely with the right combination of professional silence and political pressure. The physicians who followed Stone understood they weren't just treating patients, they were protecting a system. By August 1884, the protection machinery had evolved from gentleman's agreement to financial transaction. The informal understandings that governed presidential discretion during Grant's era had calcified into explicit arrangements involving cash payments, suppressed police reports, and carefully orchestrated cover-ups that transformed scandal management into a profitable business. Grover Cleveland's operatives demonstrated this evolution when they confronted allegations that threatened to derail his presidential campaign. The private Manhattan residence where they met wasn't chosen for comfort, but for discretion. No official records, no public scrutiny, just a quiet room where political survival could be negotiated. The allegations involved a woman, an illegitimate child, and a financial settlement that Cleveland's opponents planned to weaponize. His campaign managers understood immediately that the gentleman's agreement wouldn't suffice. This required active suppression, not passive discretion. They needed journalists silenced, not merely cooperative. They needed police reports buried, not just overlooked. And they needed documentation destroyed before it could surface in opposition newspapers that didn't share the major publishers' interest in maintaining political stability. The solution was straightforward: money. Cleveland's operatives approached newspaper editors with a proposition that transformed journalistic ethics into commodity exchange. Suppress the story and receive compensation. Publish it and lose access to the campaign, future advertising revenue, and the professional relationships that made political journalism viable. Most editors accepted the arrangement without hesitation. The few who refused found their newspapers targeted by unexpected legal challenges, sudden advertiser withdrawals, and mysterious printing press malfunctions that made publication difficult at critical moments. The financial records documenting these transactions survived in private archives, revealing a systematic pattern of payments designed to purchase silence. Amounts varied based on circulation size and editorial influence, but the mechanism remained consistent. Cash changed hands, stories disappeared, and Cleveland's campaign continued unimpeded toward victory. The cost was substantial but manageable, far cheaper than losing the presidency. Cleveland's team pioneered a model that future campaigns would refine and expand, establishing price points for discretion that would govern political scandal management for decades. Police suppression required different tactics. Local law enforcement answered to political machines that controlled municipal appointments, making cooperation relatively simple to arrange. When Cleveland's operatives needed an inconvenient investigation closed, they contacted the appropriate party boss, who contacted the appropriate police commissioner, who ensured the matter was quietly resolved. No formal orders were issued. No written instructions were preserved. The system functioned through carefully cultivated relationships and mutual understanding that political loyalty included protecting powerful men from embarrassing exposure. The ledger books that tracked these arrangements told a story that official histories omitted entirely. Line items documented payments to editors, contributions to police benevolent associations, and consulting fees paid to party operatives who specialized in making problems disappear. The numbers revealed the true cost of presidential ambition, not campaign rallies and policy proposals, but the quiet machinery of suppression that protected candidates from the consequences of their personal lives. Cleveland won his election, the allegations remained largely contained, and the protection system gained credibility that would make it indispensable to future presidential campaigns. By the early 20th century, the transactional model had become so normalized that campaign managers budgeted for scandal suppression as routinely as they budgeted for advertising. The ledger books grew thicker, the payment networks more sophisticated, and the distinction between legitimate campaign expenses and outright bribery increasingly difficult to discern. Warren Harding's campaign would perfect this system, establishing protocols that treated scandal management as a core campaign function rather than an occasional necessity. Harding's Ohio gang brought entrepreneurial creativity to presidential protection. They weren't merely suppressing scandals, they were monetizing them. The K Street poker rooms where they conducted business in June 1921 served dual purposes: recreational gambling that built relationships and strategic planning sessions that shaped policy. The line between the two was deliberately blurred. Cabinet positions were discussed over poker hands. Federal appointments were negotiated alongside betting strategies. And the chronic gambling debts that accumulated during these sessions became leverage that bound participants to silence. The poker rooms kept meticulous records, not for transparency, but for insurance. Every bet, every loss, every IOU was documented in ledgers that the Ohio gang controlled. These records served as protection against disloyalty. Anyone who threatened to expose the administration's activities would find their own gambling debts suddenly called in, their financial vulnerabilities exposed, their reputations destroyed. The ledger books that began as accounting tools had transformed into instruments of blackmail, ensuring that the protection machinery couldn't be dismantled by those it protected. Harding's team understood that the modern presidency required industrial-scale scandal suppression. The gentleman's agreement was quaint history. Financial transactions were necessary but insufficient. True protection required leverage, detailed documentation of everyone's vulnerabilities, carefully preserved and strategically deployed to maintain loyalty. The poker room became a symbol of this evolution. A place where political power was consolidated not through policy brilliance, but through systematic collection of compromising information that made betrayal impossibly expensive. The gambling debts themselves were substantial. Specific amounts remained documented in private financial records that survived despite multiple attempts to destroy them. Federal appointees owed tens of thousands of dollars to the Ohio gang's poker operation, debts that could never be repaid through legitimate government salaries. The debt became permanent leverage. a financial obligation that translated into political obedience. The appointees understood they were trapped. Pay the debt and lose their life savings. Default on the debt and lose their positions. Or accept that the debt would remain perpetual, an ongoing reminder of who actually controlled their careers. Meanwhile, the gambling debts were piling up in places that kept excellent records. The Ohio gang's ledgers documented not just poker losses, but the entire web of obligations that bound the Harding administration together. Who owed money to whom? Which debts were forgiven in exchange for political favors? Which cabinet members were compromised by financial exposure? All of it meticulously recorded in books that read like organizational charts of corruption. The ledgers revealed how transactional relationships had replaced institutional norms, how financial leverage had become the primary tool of presidential governance. The system's success depended on everyone remaining complicit. Expose one participant's gambling debts and risk your own exposure. Reveal the poker room arrangements and destroy your own career. The protection machinery had evolved into a mutual blackmail operation that made betrayal suicidal. Harding's presidency might have been remembered as weak and scandal-plagued, but the Ohio gang's innovations in scandal management would influence presidential operations for generations. They'd proven that systematic leverage could substitute for leadership, that documented vulnerabilities could ensure loyalty more effectively than moral authority. By October 1919, the White House bedroom had become a stage set for constitutional crisis. President Woodrow Wilson lay partially paralyzed from a stroke, his left side immobilized, his speech impaired, his mental clarity fluctuating between moments of reasonable lucidity and disturbing confusion. But America didn't know this. The public saw carefully managed press releases describing the president's recovery from exhaustion. The reality was orchestrated theater performed by two people who had assumed governmental authority without constitutional mandate: Dr. Cary Grayson, Wilson's physician, and Edith Wilson, the president's wife, who together became the actual executive branch for the final 17 months of Wilson's presidency. Grayson understood immediately that full disclosure would trigger constitutional proceedings to remove Wilson from office. The 25th Amendment didn't yet exist, but Congress retained power to declare the president unable to discharge his duties. Such a declaration would destroy Wilson's legacy, undermine Democratic Party power, and potentially create political chaos while the nation was still recovering from the Great War. Grayson made his choice. The presidency required protection, not transparency. Medical ethics would have to accommodate political necessity. The correspondence Grayson maintained during this period revealed his thinking with uncomfortable clarity. Letters to his wife described the president's condition honestly: the paralysis, the cognitive impairment, the uncertain prognosis. Letters to cabinet members described fictional recovery, steady improvement, and imminent return to full duties. Grayson wasn't merely being discreet. He was actively constructing a false narrative that would allow an incapacitated president to remain in office, while his wife and physician made decisions in his name. Edith Wilson's role transformed from supportive spouse to de facto president. She controlled all access to Wilson, determining which matters required presidential attention and which could be handled by cabinet secretaries without bothering him. She reviewed all documents before they reached the president, summarizing complex policy questions into simple yes or no decisions that minimized cognitive demand. And she communicated presidential decisions to government officials, often making those decisions herself and presenting them as Wilson's judgment. The arrangement was unconstitutional, unprecedented, and completely hidden from public view. The press pool agreement that made this deception possible built directly on the gentleman's agreement established decades earlier. Reporters covering the White House knew Wilson was more severely impaired than official statements suggested. Several had glimpsed him during carefully staged public appearances that revealed obvious disability. But the press corps maintained collective silence, accepting the fiction that the president was recovering normally, because the alternative, acknowledging that an unelected woman and a physician had assumed executive authority, seemed too destabilizing to report. Cabinet meetings continued without Wilson's presence, his absence explained as temporary while he focused on recovery. Secretaries presented their proposals to Edith Wilson, who claimed to relay them to the president and return with his decisions. In reality, many decisions were hers alone. She prioritized based on her own understanding of policy and politics, consulted advisors she trusted, and communicated outcomes as presidential directives. The cabinet secretaries understood what was happening, but maintained the fiction, because acknowledging it would have required confronting their own complicity in the constitutional violation. The Secret Service protocols developed during this period established procedures that would govern presidential disability management for decades. Agents were instructed to prevent unauthorized access to the private quarters, to escort approved visitors along predetermined routes that minimized exposure to the president's condition, and to maintain absolute silence about anything they observed. These protocols weren't designed to protect national security. They were designed to protect a lie that had become essential to maintaining governmental continuity. Grayson's medical notes from this period disappeared from official archives, surfacing only decades later when the Wilson family donated papers to presidential libraries. The notes documented steady deterioration, not recovery. They described a president who struggled with basic cognitive tasks, who became agitated when confronted with complex decisions, whose judgment was clearly impaired, and they revealed Grayson's awareness that he was enabling a constitutional crisis in order to prevent political chaos. His medical judgment had become subordinate to his political judgment, and he accepted this inversion as necessary service to the nation. The contrast between private reality and public performance reached its peak during the 1920 campaign season, when Wilson continued to believe he might seek a third term. Edith and Grayson discouraged this ambition not through honest medical assessment, but through careful management of information that reached the president. They filtered news, controlled his schedule, and gradually redirected his attention away from re-election, without directly confronting his diminished capacity. The manipulation was gentle but comprehensive, ensuring Wilson remained nominally president while exercising no actual power. By 1944, Franklin Roosevelt's physician, Dr. Ross McIntyre, had perfected the techniques Grayson pioneered. Roosevelt's cardiovascular disease was severe and progressive, his blood pressure dangerously elevated, his physical deterioration obvious to anyone who saw him privately. But McIntyre maintained public fiction of presidential vigor through carefully managed photo opportunities, strategic camera angles, and press pool cooperation that rivaled the Wilson-era arrangements. The campaign trail became a succession of theatrical performances designed to project strength while concealing collapse. McIntyre's innovation was medical theater at industrial scale. He didn't just manage information, he actively staged health. Roosevelt appeared in public sitting down, minimizing evidence of his deteriorating physical condition. Press photographers agreed not to photograph the president being lifted or showing obvious weakness. Newsreel footage was carefully edited to remove moments of visible fragility. And McIntyre provided optimistic medical assessments that contradicted his own private diagnoses, describing a president recovering from minor ailments while knowing he was monitoring terminal decline. The public saw vigor. The medical files told a different story of a president whose body was failing, whose doctor knew treatment was futile, and whose political circle had decided that continuing the fiction served national interest better than acknowledging reality. McIntyre's correspondence, declassified decades later, revealed his understanding that Roosevelt might not survive a fourth term. He prescribed it anyway, prioritizing electoral victory over medical honesty, accepting that the presidency required sacrifices beyond what any civilian patient would be asked to make. The medical bag that had symbolized discretion during Grant's era now contained lies as carefully prepared as any medication. The physicians who carried it understood their primary function wasn't healing, but image management. They'd become specialists in maintaining public confidence through systematic deception. experts in the gap between appearance and reality that modern presidency required. Grayson and McIntyre had transformed presidential medicine into a branch of public relations, where therapeutic decisions were subordinate to political calculations and patient welfare competed with governmental stability. By May 1961, Vienna summit preparations revealed how pharmaceutical enhancement had become standard presidential practice. Dr. Max Jacobson arrived at the White House carrying a medical bag that looked remarkably similar to the one Dr. Robert Stone had carried 90 years earlier. But Jacobson's bag contained something far more potent than morphine. His signature preparation combined amphetamines, multivitamins, steroids, and animal hormones in a mixture he called vitamin therapy and his patients called miracle shots. President John F. Kennedy had been receiving these injections for months. And now, facing the most important diplomatic meeting of his young presidency, he wanted Jacobson by his side in Vienna. The Secret Service documented Jacobson's presence in White House visitor logs that would remain sealed for decades. His entries were frequent, sometimes daily during periods of intense presidential activity. The logs revealed a pattern. High-stakes events correlated with Jacobson's visits. Major speeches, crucial negotiations, extended campaign travel, all preceded by appointments with the doctor the press would later nickname Dr. Feelgood. The injections provided what Kennedy's official physicians couldn't: energy that masked chronic pain, focus that overcame exhaustion, and chemical confidence that made 18-hour days feel manageable. Jacobson's patient list, discovered during later FDA investigations, read like a directory of American power. Cabinet members, Hollywood stars, prominent journalists, and multiple members of Kennedy's inner circle all received his injections. The shared dependency created an informal network of mutual understanding. Everyone knew what the shots contained. Everyone understood the risks, and everyone maintained silence, because exposure would destroy not just Jacobson's practice, but their own reputations. The syringe had evolved from medical treatment to performance enhancement, and the line between the two had been deliberately erased. The Vienna summit itself demonstrated the stakes. Kennedy faced Khrushchev in negotiations that could determine whether Cold War tensions escalated toward nuclear confrontation. The pressure was extraordinary, the physical demands brutal. Hours of intense discussion requiring sustained mental clarity and projecting strength to a Soviet premier who would exploit any perceived weakness. Kennedy prepared for this test not through rest and preparation alone, but through chemical assistance that his own physician, Dr. Janet Travell, had serious concerns about, but lacked authority to prevent. Secret Service testimony from later congressional investigations revealed the logistical complexity of maintaining presidential pharmaceutical dependency abroad. Jacobson traveled with the Kennedy delegation, his medical bag cleared through security without inspection, his injections administered in private moments between official events. The Secret Service agents who witnessed these sessions understood they were observing something beyond routine medical care. The frequency of injections, the president's altered demeanor afterward, the careful timing around high-pressure moments, all suggested performance enhancement rather than pain management. The FDA investigation files that eventually documented Jacobson's practice revealed disturbing patterns. His amphetamine preparations were far stronger than legitimate medical practice would justify. The dosages he prescribed carried significant addiction risk, and his record-keeping was deliberately vague, making it difficult to trace who received what and how often. When investigators finally shut down his practice in 1975, they discovered decades of pharmaceutical abuse that had affected some of the most powerful people in America. But by then, Kennedy was long dead, and the political establishment had developed sophisticated methods for protecting presidential drug use from scrutiny. Jacobson's innovation was transforming presidential medicine from treating illness to enhancing performance. The syringe became a tool for pushing human capacity beyond natural limits, for making exhausted leaders appear vigorous, for manufacturing energy that political demands required, but biology couldn't sustain. The medical bag still carried the same symbolic weight it had during Grant's presidency, but its contents had evolved from painkillers that managed suffering to stimulants that created artificial capability. The consequences extended beyond Kennedy. Vice President Lyndon Johnson received Jacobson's treatments. Several cabinet members maintained relationships with doctors who provided similar services. The performance pressure of modern presidency had created market demand for pharmaceutical enhancement, and medical professionals willing to prioritize results over ethics filled that demand without difficulty. The question wasn't whether presidential performance required chemical assistance that had been normalized decades earlier, but rather how sophisticated that assistance could become before it crossed from medicine into dangerous experimentation. And he wasn't the only one getting injections. The amphetamine culture that Jacobson represented had spread throughout Washington's power structure. Congressional leaders, military commanders, and senior administration officials all sought similar pharmaceutical advantages. The Cold War's demands created a performance arms race where chemical enhancement became a competitive necessity. Leaders who refused such assistance found themselves at disadvantage against those who embraced it. The syringe became a symbol not of medical treatment, but of institutional pressure that pushed everyone toward the same dangerous solution. The medical establishment's response to Jacobson was revealing. Some physicians condemned his practices as unethical and dangerous, but many more quietly referred patients to him, understanding that political success sometimes required medical interventions that conventional ethics wouldn't permit. The gap between public medical standards and private pharmaceutical reality had widened into a chasm. Doctors who served powerful patients learned to accommodate demands that would be refused in ordinary practice. The Hippocratic Oath competed with political necessity, and political necessity usually won. By the late 1960s, the amphetamine administration had established protocols that would influence presidential medicine for decades. The injections became normalized as performance tools rather than questioned as dangerous dependencies. The physicians who provided them were protected by the same institutional discretion that had shielded presidential doctors since Grant's era. And the American public remained unaware that their leaders' apparently superhuman energy levels often derived from syringes filled with carefully calibrated pharmaceutical cocktails designed to manufacture capability that exhausted bodies could no longer naturally produce. The motif had transformed completely. What began as a physician's bag containing painkillers for wounded generals had become a delivery system for performance enhancement that pushed presidents beyond human limits. The syringe that once symbolized medical care now represented institutional pressure to chemically augment leadership capacity, and the doctors who administered these injections had evolved from healers protecting patients to enablers facilitating a pharmaceutical arms race that made natural human limitations seem like political liabilities requiring chemical correction. By October 1973, the Yom Kippur War Crisis Room revealed how alcoholism had embedded itself in presidential decision-making at the highest levels. The National Security Council meeting transcripts from that period documented not just the strategic decisions being made, but the conditions under which they were made. Late-night sessions, exhausted participants, and widespread alcohol consumption that was treated as normal stress management, rather than dangerous impairment during potential nuclear crisis. The whiskey decanter that sat on the conference table wasn't decorative. It was functional, frequently refilled, and rarely questioned. The crisis itself demanded extraordinary alertness. Soviet forces appeared to be preparing intervention in the Middle East. American intelligence suggested nuclear weapons might be involved. The situation required rapid assessment, clear thinking, and decisions that could determine whether superpower confrontation escalated toward the unthinkable. Instead, key meetings occurred after midnight, with participants who had been drinking for hours, making life or death judgments while impaired in ways that would disqualify them from operating vehicles, much less managing nuclear arsenals. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's memoirs, published years later, included carefully worded passages describing the informal atmosphere of late-night crisis management sessions. Other participants' accounts were less diplomatic, describing substantial alcohol consumption during crucial decision points. The Defense Department's official history acknowledged that fatigue and stress affected participants without explicitly mentioning the alcohol that both caused and temporarily masked that fatigue. The institutional silence around impaired decision-making during nuclear crisis demonstrated how normalized alcoholism had become in executive branch operations. The National Security Council meeting transcripts themselves provided indirect evidence through their timing and progression. Early evening sessions showed coherent policy debate and careful consideration of options. Late-night transcripts revealed increasingly erratic decision patterns, aggressive posturing, and strategic choices that seemed more reactive than analytical. The transcripts didn't mention alcohol because official stenographers understood that certain observations remained off the record. But the progression from measured analysis to impulsive confrontation followed patterns that anyone familiar with alcohol's effects would recognize immediately. Secret Service alcohol purchase logs, discovered during later archival research, documented extraordinary consumption levels during crisis periods. Cases of whiskey delivered to the White House Situation Room, wine ordered for late-night working dinners, and beer stocked in executive office refrigerators, all tracked in procurement records that revealed the scale of drinking that accompanied high-stakes decision-making. The quantities suggested not social lubrication, but dependency. Not occasional stress relief, but systematic reliance on alcohol as a cognitive coping mechanism during exactly the moments when sobriety was most crucial. The nuclear protocols that were nearly triggered during the Yom Kippur War crisis demonstrated the stakes of impaired leadership. Defense Condition 3 was implemented, a heightened alert status that brought American forces closer to nuclear readiness than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The decision was made during a late-night session where multiple participants were demonstrably impaired. The fact that nuclear war didn't result owed more to Soviet restraint and mid-level military officers' caution than to the clarity of American executive decision-making. Betty Ford's later testimony about her husband's administration provided rare public acknowledgement of the drinking culture that pervaded executive branch operations. She described alcoholism as pervasive, normalized, and actively encouraged by the intense stress of presidential politics. Her willingness to discuss her own addiction opened brief windows into a reality that official histories still largely omitted: the regular impairment of senior officials making decisions that affected millions of lives. Ford's honesty was unusual. Most participants maintained lifelong silence about what they'd witnessed and participated in. The whiskey decanter evolved from social lubricant to liability as the nuclear age made impaired judgment exponentially more dangerous. What might have been acceptable risk when presidential decisions affected domestic policy became existential threat when those decisions could trigger global annihilation. But the drinking culture didn't adjust to match the elevated stakes. Instead, institutional denial intensified, protecting officials whose alcoholism should have disqualified them from crisis management roles, but whose political importance made removal unthinkable. The crisis room itself became a symbol of this contradiction. The most sophisticated communications technology available, direct lines to military commands worldwide, real-time intelligence feeds from multiple agencies, all operated by officials whose judgment was compromised by entirely preventable impairment. The technological capacity to manage nuclear crisis was undermined by the human vulnerability to addiction that the same high-stress environment fostered. The whiskey decanter sitting beside the red phone captured this absurdity perfectly. The tools of Armageddon and the tools of self-medication sharing the same space. Which brings us to the pills. While alcohol provided crude impairment that officials could pretend was merely stress relief, prescription medications offered more sophisticated dysfunction. Barbiturates to counter the amphetamines, sedatives to enable sleep despite the stimulants, anti-anxiety medications to manage the psychological toll of constant crisis. By the 1970s, senior officials weren't just drinking, they were navigating complex pharmaceutical interactions that would challenge a trained pharmacologist to manage safely. The White House Medical Unit dispensed medications with concerning frequency, creating drug interactions that official physicians either didn't understand or chose not to address. The drinking cabinet had become a pharmaceutical cabinet, with alcohol supplemented by prescription drugs that officials obtained easily through White House physicians who understood that refusing treatment requests could cost them their positions. The medical unit logs documented staggering quantities of controlled substances dispensed to senior officials: sleeping pills, stimulants, tranquilizers, and painkillers, all distributed with minimal oversight or concern for abuse potential. The officials receiving these medications were making decisions about war and peace, economic policy, and civil rights, while navigating chemical cocktails that made basic cognitive function uncertain. The aid memoirs that survived from this period revealed widespread awareness that impairment was routine and problematic. Staff members documented concerns about officials who appeared intoxicated during important meetings. Security personnel noted erratic behavior that suggested pharmaceutical impairment, but these observations remained in private files, never reaching public attention, protected by the same institutional discretion that had shielded presidential vices for a century. The system prioritized continuity over safety, protecting careers over acknowledging that the nation's leadership was operating under conditions that would be considered unacceptable in virtually any other high-stakes profession. By March 1981, post-assassination attempt recovery revealed how prescription medication had become the primary tool of presidential functionality management. President Ronald Reagan survived John Hinckley's gunshot, but the injury and subsequent surgeries created pain management challenges that his physician, Dr. Daniel Rouge, addressed through aggressive pharmaceutical intervention. The prescriptions that flowed from the White House medical unit during Reagan's recovery established patterns that would continue throughout his presidency: regular painkillers, anti-anxiety medications, and sleep aids that accumulated into a pharmaceutical regimen far more complex than public. Health bulletins suggested Dr. William Lukash, who had served as White House physician during the Ford and Carter administrations, had pioneered the modern approach to presidential pharmaceutical management. His medical unit logs, declassified decades later, documented systematic prescription of controlled substances to multiple administration officials, with minimal oversight or coordination between prescribers. The logs revealed what amounted to on-demand pharmaceutical access for senior officials who could obtain prescriptions simply by requesting them from White House physicians who understood that their job security depended on accommodation rather than refusal. The Drug Enforcement Administration investigation that was later quietly dropped had discovered troubling patterns in White House medical unit prescribing practices. Controlled substances were being dispensed in quantities that exceeded legitimate medical need. Officials were receiving prescriptions from multiple doctors without adequate coordination to prevent dangerous drug interactions. And the record-keeping was sufficiently vague to make it difficult to track who received what medications, how often, and for what conditions. The investigation suggested systematic prescription abuse, but political pressure ensured the findings were buried before they could generate public scrutiny. Rouge's approach to Reagan's pain management reflected the institutional pressure to prioritize presidential function over patient safety. The assassination attempt had left Reagan with chronic pain that legitimate medical treatment might have addressed through careful, conservative prescription practices. Instead, Rouge prescribed aggressively, ensuring the president remained functional for demanding schedules that his age and injury should have prohibited. The pharmaceutical solution was politically necessary but medically questionable, pushing an elderly patient recovering from serious trauma to maintain activity levels that required chemical assistance to achieve. The pharmacology records that survived from Reagan's presidency documented extraordinary prescription medication use. Not just painkillers for his gunshot injury, but sleeping medications to manage disrupted sleep patterns, anti-anxiety drugs to address stress, and various other pharmaceuticals that accumulated into a regimen requiring careful management to prevent dangerous interactions. The White House medical unit was dispensing medications that, in combination, created risks that competent physicians should have refused to accept. But competent physicians working in normal medical contexts didn't face the political pressure that White House doctors navigated daily. The addiction risk that these prescribing patterns created was obvious to anyone familiar with pharmaceutical dependency. Opioid painkillers prescribed for months or years create physical dependence. Benzodiazepines used regularly cause tolerance that requires escalating doses. Sleeping medications lose effectiveness over time, leading to increased use. The White House physicians prescribing these medications understood these risks, but prescribed anyway, accepting that presidential function required pharmaceutical interventions that conventional medical ethics would prohibit. The DIA investigation files revealed the scope of what investigators discovered before political intervention shut them down. Multiple administration officials were receiving prescriptions that suggested dependency rather than legitimate medical treatment. The quantities of controlled substances moving through the White House medical unit exceeded what careful pain management or anxiety treatment would require. And the prescribing patterns showed officials receiving medications from multiple doctors, a classic warning sign of prescription drug abuse. The investigators believed they had documented systematic pharmaceutical misconduct at the highest levels of government. Their superiors believed the investigation threatened institutional stability and ordered it terminated. Pain management protocols that expanded during Reagan's presidency established precedents that would govern White House medical practice for decades. The aggressive prescribing that Rouge normalized became standard approach for subsequent presidential physicians. The institutional acceptance of pharmaceutical dependency as necessary cost of presidential function became embedded in White House medical culture. And the oversight mechanisms that might have prevented abuse were deliberately weakened to ensure that political concerns trumped medical ethics whenever the two conflicted. The medical files that stayed sealed for 40 years documented what White House physicians knew but couldn't publicly acknowledge: that modern presidential demands exceeded human capacity, that pharmaceutical assistance had become essential to bridging that gap, and that the health consequences of this reliance were being deliberately ignored in favor of maintaining governmental continuity. When these files were finally declassified, they revealed decades of medical decisions that prioritized political function over patient welfare, creating patterns of pharmaceutical dependency that no responsible physician would have accepted in ordinary practice. Rouge's correspondence with his medical colleagues, preserved in his personal papers, revealed his private struggles with the ethical compromises his position required. He understood that his prescribing patterns were medically questionable. He worried about the long-term consequences of pharmaceutical dependency, and he resented the political pressure that made it impossible to practice medicine according to the standards he'd been trained to uphold. But he prescribed anyway, accepting that White House medicine operated under different rules than ordinary medical practice. Rules that prioritized presidential image over patient health. The prescription pad that had once symbolized medical care had transformed into institutional cover for pharmaceutical dependency. Doctors wrote prescriptions not because patients needed the medications, but because the presidency needed functional patients. The distinction between treating illness and enabling dysfunction had been deliberately obscured. And the physicians who participated in this system protected themselves through the same institutional discretion that had shielded presidential doctors for a century: careful documentation that revealed little, public statements that concealed much, and private knowledge that died with them. The pharmaceutical records that eventually surfaced documented not just Reagan's medication use, but a broader pattern of prescription drug dependency throughout executive branch leadership. Cabinet members receiving chronic painkillers. Senior advisors using anti-anxiety medications long-term. Military commanders taking sleeping pills that warned against operating heavy machinery. The White House medical unit had become a prescription mill serving officials whose positions made refusal impossible, and whose dependencies made supervision dangerous. The system worked exactly as designed, keeping officials functional through chemical assistance while concealing the costs of that assistance from public awareness. By the mid-1980s, the normalization was complete. Prescription drug dependency was no longer considered a problem requiring intervention, but rather a management challenge requiring discretion. White House physicians understood their job wasn't treating patients according to medical best practices, but maintaining official functionality according to political necessity. The prescription pad became a tool for managing the gap between human limitations and institutional demands. And the medications that filled that gap, painkillers, stimulants, sedatives, anti-anxiety drugs, accumulated into pharmaceutical regimens that made officials chemically dependent on the very system designed to protect them from scrutiny. By November 1950, the Senate caucus room became the stage where Senator Estes Kefauver's gambling investigation threatened to expose connections between organized crime, campaign finance, and White House access that had operated in shadows for decades. The Special Committee to Investigate Crime and Interstate Commerce, known simply as the Kefauver Committee, had been conducting hearings across the country, documenting the machinery of illegal gambling operations and their relationships with political power. What they discovered in their investigation files went beyond simple corruption into systematic integration of organized gambling into American political finance. The FBI surveillance files that Kefauver's committee accessed revealed disturbing patterns. Campaign contributions from individuals with documented ties to illegal gambling operations, federal appointments going to lawyers who represented organized crime figures, White House visitor logs showing meetings between administration officials and known gambling operators. The connections weren't hidden so much as normalized. Everyone involved understood that campaign finance required money from sources that polite society officially condemned, but political reality quietly accommodated. The gambling investigation testimony that filled hundreds of pages of congressional records documented specific mechanisms by which organized crime money entered political campaigns. Cash was laundered through legitimate businesses. Contributions came from front men with no obvious criminal connections. And the amounts were calibrated to stay below thresholds that might trigger scrutiny. The system was sophisticated, well-established, and protected by mutual understanding that exposing it would damage both the criminals providing money and the politicians receiving it. Kefauver's committee identified specific organized crime figures who had maintained relationships with multiple presidential administrations. Frank Costello's testimony, delivered with calculated evasion, acknowledged knowing various political figures while denying any improper influence. Meyer Lansky's offshore gambling operations had generated profits that investigation files suggested found their way into campaign coffers through intermediaries whose legal activities obscured criminal sources. The committee documented the machinery but lacked authority to prosecute, creating a public record of corruption without corresponding accountability. The offshore account traces that committee investigators followed revealed how gambling profits were cleaned before entering political finance. Money moved through Caribbean banks, emerged as investment returns or business profits, and entered campaigns as apparently legitimate contributions. The tracking required sophisticated financial analysis that 1950s investigative capacity could barely manage. The committee knew they were seeing only surface evidence of deeper financial integration, but their limited resources and political constraints prevented comprehensive exposure. Campaign debts created particular vulnerability. Candidates who couldn't raise sufficient legitimate funds turned to sources willing to provide money with implicit expectations of future access. The gambling operators who filled this gap weren't making charitable contributions. They were purchasing influence that would protect their operations from prosecution, ensure favorable regulatory treatment, and provide warning when law enforcement attention threatened their interests. The poker chips that represented recreational gambling had transformed into currency of political influence, tokens exchanged for protection that made illegal operations sustainable. The Kefauver hearings themselves became television spectacle, drawing audiences fascinated by the glimpse into organized crime's political machinery. But the spectacle obscured what the investigation revealed: that the relationship between gambling money and political power was mutually dependent and deeply embedded. Shutting down organized crime's political access would have required reforming campaign finance systems that both parties benefited from. The hearings generated headlines, but little structural change. By the 1960s, the patterns Kefauver documented had become more sophisticated, but fundamentally unchanged. Presidential campaigns still needed money from sources that official ethics prohibited. Gambling operations still provided that money in exchange for protection, and the intermediaries who connected the two had perfected methods for obscuring transactions that everyone involved understood, but few could prove. The poker room where these arrangements were negotiated had moved from K Street backrooms to more sophisticated venues, but the fundamental exchange remained identical. The documented White House connections that survived in FBI files showed organized crime figures gaining access to administration officials through campaign contributions and intermediary relationships. Not direct bribes that prosecutors could charge, but systematic cultivation of influence through financial support that created obligation without explicit quid pro quo. The files documented meetings, contributions, and subsequent policy decisions that benefited gambling interests, all legal individually, all suspicious collectively, all protected by the difficulty of proving corrupt intent beyond reasonable doubt. Campaign cycles throughout the 1970s showed continued gambling money integration into political finance. Investigation files from the ears and FBI documented cash flowing from Las Vegas casinos, offshore gambling operations, and illegal bookmaking enterprises into campaign coffers through laundering schemes that had grown more sophisticated as law enforcement scrutiny increased. The amounts were substantial enough to matter, but small enough to obscure among overall campaign finance totals that had grown exponentially as television advertising made campaigns increasingly expensive. And then things got weird. The poker chips that had symbolized this exchange began appearing as physical evidence in corruption investigations that occasionally broke through institutional protection. A federal prosecutor in New Jersey discovered poker chips from illegal gambling operations in the safe deposit box of a campaign treasurer. A customs investigation found chips from offshore casinos being used as tokens to track contribution amounts. The physical artifacts of gambling had become the literal currency of political finance, making the metaphorical connection absurdly concrete. By the 1980s, the gambling investigation testimony that occasionally surfaced in federal corruption trials revealed the full integration of organized gambling into political finance. Witnesses described campaign contributions negotiated during poker games, federal appointments discussed alongside betting strategies, and policy decisions influenced by debts accumulated at gambling tables. The testimony portrayed a political culture where gambling wasn't a vice to be hidden, but a venue where serious business was conducted, where campaign finance and recreational gambling had merged into a single activity that served multiple purposes simultaneously. The leverage that gambling debt created extended beyond direct political corruption into personal vulnerability that ensured loyalty. Officials who accumulated substantial gambling debts to organized crime figures found themselves trapped between exposure and cooperation. Pay the debts and lose financial security. Default and lose reputation, or accept that the debts would remain as permanent leverage, ensuring compliance with requests that could be framed as favors between friends rather than coercion between criminals and compromised officials. The poker chips represented not just gambling losses, but permanent obligations that made independence impossible. The Senate investigations that periodically revisited organized crime's political connections found the same patterns Kefauver documented decades earlier, only more sophisticated and better protected. The fundamental reality remained unchanged. Political campaigns needed money, gambling operations had money, and intermediaries connected the two in ways that maintained plausible deniability while ensuring mutual benefit. The investigations generated reports that documented corruption everyone suspected, but few could prove, creating public records that changed little because the underlying incentives remained constant. By August 1974, the post-resignation medical review of President Richard Nixon's health records opened unprecedented scrutiny into presidential medical practices that had operated in darkness for a century. Dr. John Lundgren, Nixon's physician, found himself testifying before congressional investigators who were examining not just Watergate's political crimes, but the medical infrastructure that had enabled and concealed various forms of presidential impairment. Watergate had blown open institutional protections that had seemed impenetrable just months earlier. The medical establishment's careful discretion was suddenly vulnerable to investigation. The congressional testimony excerpts that survived from these hearings revealed doctors struggling with conflicting obligations. Lundgren described his role as requiring both medical care and institutional protection, acknowledging that these duties sometimes conflicted, but insisting he'd always prioritized patient welfare. His testimony was carefully worded, admitting enough to seem forthcoming, while concealing details that might expose the full scope of medical complicity in presidential dysfunction. The congressional investigators understood they were hearing edited truth, but Watergate had created political climate where even partial medical transparency represented progress. Medical board hearings that examined White House physicians' conduct revealed ethical ambiguities that professional medical associations had long avoided confronting. Should doctors prioritize patient confidentiality or public safety when treating officials whose impairment might affect millions? Were White House physicians obligated to disclose presidential health conditions that might render their patient unfit for office? The hearings produced no definitive answers, but established that such questions were at least discussable, breaking decades of professional silence around presidential medical ethics. Whistleblower interviews with medical personnel who had served in White House medical units provided disturbing glimpses into routine practices. Nurses described being instructed to falsify medication logs. Pharmacists reported pressure to dispense controlled substances without proper documentation. Medical technicians witnessed treatments they considered dangerous, but were warned that reporting concerns would end their careers. The whistleblowers spoke carefully, often anonymously, protected by journalists who understood that full exposure would make sources vulnerable to retaliation that could destroy them professionally. The Watergate investigation's collateral damage had created temporary vulnerability in systems designed to be impenetrable. Congressional investigators who had successfully penetrated White House secrecy around political crimes felt emboldened to question medical practices that had operated beyond scrutiny for generations. The medical establishment responded with strategic transparency, acknowledging past problems while insisting reforms had addressed them, admitting ethical challenges while maintaining that protocols protected patient confidentiality appropriately. The partial disclosure was calculated to satisfy public curiosity without exposing the full machinery of medical complicity. Lundgren's testimony included careful admissions about pharmaceutical prescribing during Nixon's final months in office. He acknowledged that the president had been under extraordinary stress, that sleep had been difficult, that medication had been prescribed to manage anxiety and insomnia. He didn't specify what medications, in what quantities, or how their combined effects might have influenced presidential judgment during the constitutional crisis. The gaps in his testimony were as revealing as his admissions, showing the limits of medical transparency that congressional investigators could compel. The limited medical transparency that emerged from post-Watergate scrutiny established precedents that would govern presidential medicine for decades. White House physicians would acknowledge general health conditions while protecting specific treatment details. They would admit pharmaceutical use while obscuring quantities and combinations. They would accept oversight in principle while resisting it in practice. The reforms created appearance of accountability without substantially changing the reality that presidential medical care operated under different rules than ordinary medical practice. Medical ethics investigators who reviewed White House medical unit practices found systematic problems that no one seemed authorized to fix. The prescribing patterns suggested dependency rather than treatment. The record-keeping obscured rather than documented care. The professional oversight was minimal to non-existent. But the investigators also discovered that White House physicians faced pressures that conventional medical practice didn't accommodate. Political necessity competed with medical ethics constantly, and political necessity usually won because the alternative was losing their positions to doctors more willing to accommodate institutional demands. The testimony fragments that emerged from various investigations, hearings, and interviews created a mosaic of medical dysfunction without producing comprehensive exposure. Each investigation revealed pieces of the puzzle: aggressive prescribing here, impaired decision-making there, falsified records somewhere else. But institutional protection prevented anyone from assembling the complete picture. The medical establishment wanted reforms that would prevent future scrutiny, not transparency that would expose past complicity. But transparency had limits. The congressional investigators who briefly gained access to medical practices during post-Watergate scrutiny discovered that institutional protection had multiple layers. White House physicians invoked patient confidentiality. Medical boards cited professional ethics. Government lawyers claimed executive privilege. The brief window of vulnerability that Watergate created closed as political norms were reestablished and institutional protections were rebuilt stronger than before, incorporating lessons learned about how to better resist future scrutiny. The medical records that congressional investigators sought remained largely sealed, protected by claims that release would violate patient privacy and undermine the doctor-patient relationship essential to effective medical care. The claim wasn't entirely dishonest. Presidential medical records did contain sensitive information that disclosure might exploit politically, but the privacy protection also concealed decades of medical decisions that prioritized political image over patient health, that enabled pharmaceutical dependency rather than treating it, and that made physicians complicit in institutional deception that occasionally crossed into medical. Malpractice. Lundgren's private correspondence with medical colleagues, preserved in archives that wouldn't be opened for decades, revealed his understanding that Watergate had created temporary vulnerability that the medical establishment needed to contain. He described strategies for limited disclosure that would satisfy public curiosity without exposing the full scope of questionable medical practices. He advised colleagues to acknowledge general problems while protecting specific details that could generate criminal or civil liability. And he expressed confidence that institutional protection would reassert itself once the political crisis passed and normal deference to presidential privacy was restored. The investigative journalists who pursued presidential medical stories during this period discovered that sources willing to speak faced severe professional consequences. Medical personnel who provided even anonymous information found themselves frozen out of government positions. Physicians who questioned White House medical practices lost access to influential medical circles. The retaliation was quiet but effective, sending clear message that medical discretion around presidential health remained non-negotiable despite temporary disruption from Watergate's political fallout. By 1976, the brief opening that allowed scrutiny of presidential medical practices had largely closed. New privacy regulations provided legal justification for sealing records that might have been accessible during Watergate's chaos. White House medical unit protocols were quietly revised to make future investigations more difficult. And the medical establishment reasserted professional norms that treated presidential health as uniquely protected information requiring discretion that would be considered obstruction in ordinary medical contexts. The pattern that emerged from this period showed how institutional protection could absorb scrutiny, make symbolic reforms, and reestablish barriers stronger than before. The medical profession acknowledged problems while insisting they'd been addressed. Congressional investigators declared victory while accepting minimal transparency. The press reported on reforms while lacking access to verify whether actual practices had changed. And the machinery of presidential medical protection continued operating largely as before, slightly more careful about documentation, marginally more sophisticated about concealment, but fundamentally unchanged in its commitment to protecting presidential image over ensuring presidential health. The motif had transformed from protected secret to partial evidence. Medical records that were completely sealed before Watergate became theoretically accessible, but practically concealed through privacy protections, classification, and institutional resistance. The transformation created appearance of transparency while maintaining the reality of secrecy. Future historians would gain access to some records after decades of delay, discovering medical decisions that should have generated immediate scrutiny but remained hidden until everyone involved was beyond accountability. The medical bag still contained secrets, but now those secrets were wrapped in privacy regulations and professional ethics claims that made them legally, rather than just institutionally protected. By April 1978, Betty Ford's decision to publicly acknowledge her alcohol and prescription drug dependency at Long Beach Naval Hospital represented the first time a first family member had confronted addiction openly rather than through institutional denial. Her admission shattered decades of careful image management, exposing pharmaceutical and alcohol dependency that everyone in Washington understood, but nobody acknowledged. The treatment facility itself was military, government-run, secure, and equipped to handle high-profile patients whose presence required absolute discretion, despite the very public nature of Ford's disclosure. Betty Ford's autobiography excerpts, published after her treatment, described the descent into dependency with uncommon honesty. She detailed the prescription medications that White House physicians had provided freely: painkillers for a pinched nerve, anti-anxiety medications for the stress of political life, sleeping pills to manage disrupted schedules. She described how these medications accumulated into a pharmaceutical regimen that she couldn't safely stop without medical supervision. And she acknowledged the alcohol that had started as social drinking and progressed into dependency that she'd hidden even from herself until crisis forced recognition. The treatment facility records that documented Ford's recovery remained private, protected by medical confidentiality. But the fact of her treatment was entirely public, covered extensively by media that treated her disclosure as courageous rather than scandalous. The public response revealed cultural shift in how addiction was understood, less as moral failing, more as medical condition requiring treatment. Ford's openness created space for others to acknowledge similar struggles. Within months, the Betty Ford Center would be established, providing addiction treatment that carried her name and carried forward her mission of reducing stigma around dependency. White House response memos from the period showed careful calibration of how the administration should address the First Lady's disclosure. Press secretaries drafted statements emphasizing her courage while avoiding any suggestion that White House medical practices might have contributed to her dependency. Political advisors debated whether the disclosure would damage President Ford's political standing or generate sympathy. The memos revealed institutional concern about precedent. If First Ladies could publicly acknowledge addiction, what other carefully protected secrets might future officials feel empowered to disclose? Ford's medical team at Long Beach included specialists in addiction medicine who understood they were treating not just a patient, but a symbol. Their careful management of her recovery considered medical needs alongside political implications. They coordinated with White House physicians to ensure continuity of legitimate medical care while addressing the pharmaceutical dependency those same physicians had helped create. The treatment represented both medical intervention and damage control, healing an individual while protecting institutional systems that had enabled her dependency. The disclosure's immediate impact was personal rather than systemic. Betty Ford recovered, became an advocate for addiction treatment, and transformed public conversation about dependency. But White House medical practices didn't fundamentally change. Physicians continued prescribing controlled substances with minimal oversight. Officials continued developing pharmaceutical dependencies that interfered with their duties. And the medical infrastructure that had enabled Ford's addiction continued operating largely unchanged, protected by the same institutional discretion that had concealed presidential vices for a century. The cultural change Ford catalyzed was real but limited. Public discussion of addiction became more open. Treatment was increasingly understood as appropriate medical intervention rather than shameful weakness. Celebrities and public figures began acknowledging dependencies that previous generations would have hidden. But these changes occurred primarily outside government. Inside the White House, the old protections remained largely intact, slightly modernized to accommodate new cultural expectations, but fundamentally committed to concealing official impairment from public scrutiny. Ford's public statements about her recovery were carefully crafted to acknowledge personal struggle while avoiding criticism of systems that had facilitated her dependency. She spoke about her own choices and their consequences, without examining how White House medical practices made those choices almost inevitable. The careful framing protected her husband's administration while limiting the disclosure's potential to generate systemic reform. Personal courage was channeled into individual advocacy rather than institutional critique. The confession itself had transformed from scandal to managed narrative. What might have destroyed political careers in earlier eras became a redemption story that enhanced rather than damaged the Fords' public standing. The transformation reflected changing cultural attitudes, but also sophisticated public relations management that turned potential disaster into opportunity. Ford's honesty was genuine, but its presentation was carefully orchestrated to maximize positive impact while minimizing institutional exposure. By 1980, Betty Ford's recovery had become a celebrated example of addiction treatment success, but the systems that had enabled her dependency remained essentially unchanged. White House physicians still prescribed controlled substances freely. Officials still developed pharmaceutical dependencies without appropriate medical supervision. And the institutional protection that concealed these realities had adapted to new cultural expectations by acknowledging addiction's existence in abstract while continuing to hide its prevalence in practice. The treatment facility where Ford recovered became landmark in addiction medicine, but White House medical units didn't adopt the careful prescribing practices that addiction specialists recommended. The gap between public advocacy and institutional practice revealed the limits of personal courage to drive systemic change. Ford had opened doors for millions struggling with addiction, but she hadn't, perhaps couldn't, force the government medical establishment to confront its role in creating and enabling official dependency. Meanwhile, the next administration was already making the same mistakes. Ronald Reagan's White House medical unit would prescribe painkillers, anti-anxiety medications, and sleeping pills with the same casual frequency that had characterized previous administrations. The pharmaceutical dependency that Ford had courageously acknowledged would continue affecting senior officials whose impairment would remain carefully concealed. And the institutional mechanisms that protected official dysfunction would operate smoothly, having learned from Ford's disclosure how to better control narratives around addiction without actually changing practices that created it. The motif had evolved from scandal to managed narrative. What began as shameful secret to be hidden at all costs had become story of recovery that could enhance rather than destroy careers, but only if carefully framed, properly managed, and divorced from examination of institutional systems that facilitated dependency. Ford's confession was transformative for addiction treatment generally, but had limited impact on government medical practices specifically. Personal courage had collided with institutional inertia, generating cultural change outside government while leaving the machinery of official medical dysfunction largely intact. The Long Beach Naval Hospital, where Ford received treatment, represented both progress and limitation. It was a government facility equipped to handle addiction treatment, acknowledging that dependency affected officials as well as ordinary citizens. But it was also a secure installation where treatment could occur away from public observation, protecting privacy in ways that enabled continued institutional discretion. The facility symbolized contradiction at the heart of Ford's disclosure, genuine acknowledgement of addiction, combined with continued commitment to protecting official image from scrutiny that full transparency would require. By November 1994, post-midterm crisis management revealed how information control had evolved to meet challenges of the emerging 24-hour news cycle. The press operation protocols that governed White House communications had grown exponentially more sophisticated since Betty Ford's era, incorporating lessons learned from decades of scandal management into comprehensive systems designed to control narrative before problems could develop. The Clinton administration's response to Republican congressional victories demonstrated these evolved capabilities: rapid response teams, coordinated talking points, and aggressive pushback against negative coverage that would have seemed impossible in earlier decades. White House press operation protocols from this period showed systematic approaches to information control that previous administrations had managed through informal networks. Official documents outlined procedures for responding to breaking news, coordinating messaging across government agencies, and managing media relationships to ensure favorable coverage. The protocols treated information control as core governmental function requiring professional management, not occasional necessity to be handled through improvisation and personal relationships. The suppressed journalist investigations that occasionally surfaced decades later revealed how this information control operated in practice. Reporters who pursued stories about official misconduct found sources suddenly unavailable, documents mysteriously lost, and access to administration officials withdrawn. The suppression wasn't crude censorship, but sophisticated pressure that made investigation difficult without appearing to interfere directly. Journalists faced career calculations, pursue the story and lose access, or maintain relationships and receive information that served administration interests. Pharmaceutical company cooperation agreements that connected private sector interests to government information control represented new dimension in institutional protection. Drug manufacturers, whose medications were prescribed extensively in White House medical units, had incentive to suppress information about dependency and side effects that might generate scrutiny of official pharmaceutical use. The cooperation was mutually beneficial. Companies protected their products from negative publicity, administrations protected their officials from exposure, and the agreements themselves remained confidential to prevent public awareness of this coordination. The specific press secretaries and medical unit chiefs who managed this system operated under protocols that made them functionally interchangeable. Individual names mattered less than the institutional roles they filled and the procedures they followed. The system was designed to survive personnel changes, ensuring that information control capabilities remained consistent regardless of which specific individuals occupied key positions. This institutional continuity made the protection machinery more resilient than systems that depended on particular individuals' skill or discretion. The 24-hour news cycle arrival created pressure that earlier protection systems couldn't withstand. Continuous coverage meant stories could break at any time, requiring immediate response before narrative could be shaped. Cable news needed constant content, making scandals more valuable and scrutiny more intense. The old gentleman's agreement where newspapers decided what to publish had been replaced by competitive environment where any outlet could break stories that others would be forced to cover. The information control systems that worked when media operated on daily publication schedules required complete redesign for continuous news environment. The Clinton administration's response demonstrated how modern information control adapted to these challenges. Rapid response teams monitored news coverage constantly, prepared talking points instantly, and pushed back aggressively against negative stories before they could gain traction. The strategy wasn't preventing scandals, that was impossible in the new media environment, but rather managing them so effectively that individual revelations generated brief attention before being displaced by the next story. Scandal management had evolved from suppression to acceleration, using media's short attention span as protection rather than fighting against continuous coverage. The medical unit chiefs during this period managed pharmaceutical prescribing while navigating increased scrutiny from investigative journalists, who had tools earlier generations lacked. Computer databases could track prescriptions across providers, financial records could reveal pharmaceutical industry payments, and whistleblowers had new channels for disclosing information without going through traditional media gatekeepers. The medical establishment responded by further obscuring prescribing practices, using vague diagnostic coding, and distributing responsibilities across multiple providers to prevent any single person from having comprehensive picture of official pharmaceutical use. The press operation's sophisticated information control created appearance of transparency while maintaining functional secrecy. Administration officials gave extensive press briefings that provided enormous amounts of information about trivial matters, while carefully avoiding disclosure of anything substantively important. The volume of available information made it difficult for journalists to identify what was being concealed. The strategy buried significant secrets under mountains of insignificant disclosures, exploiting media's limited capacity to process the flood of available information. By the late 1990s, the technology changed, but the secrets didn't. Email created new documentation of official communications that might expose misconduct, requiring new protocols for avoiding creating discoverable records. Digital prescribing systems improved tracking of pharmaceutical use, necessitating new methods for obscuring patterns that might indicate dependency. And internet journalism created new outlets for information that traditional media wouldn't cover, demanding new strategies for managing stories that could spread through channels beyond institutional media's control. The protection machinery adapted to each technological change, incorporating new tools while maintaining commitment to concealing official dysfunction. Secure communication systems ensured sensitive discussions left no records. Digital prescription systems were configured to prevent easy analysis of aggregate prescribing patterns. And media monitoring expanded to track online discussions, allowing rapid response to stories before they gained sufficient attention to require traditional media coverage. The institutional commitment to secrecy remained constant, while the methods evolved continuously. The press releases that became primary vehicle for official communication transformed from straightforward information sharing to sophisticated narrative control instruments. Each release was crafted to emphasize certain facts while omitting others, to frame issues in ways that served administration interests, and to provide quotable content that would be repeated uncritically by media outlets lacking resources for independent verification. The press release became a tool for shaping reality rather than describing it, creating an official version of events that would dominate coverage regardless of underlying facts. The pharmaceutical company cooperation that protected official drug use operated through informal relationships that left minimal documentation. Company representatives understood that maintaining good relations with government medical units required discretion about prescription patterns that might indicate dependency or abuse. The cooperation included suppressing internal research that might question safety of medications prescribed extensively to officials, avoiding publicity that might draw attention to pharmaceutical use in government, and providing support for messaging that presented prescription drugs as safe and appropriate for managing stress and performance demands. The investigative journalism that occasionally penetrated these protections revealed disturbing patterns but struggled to generate sustained public attention. Stories about official pharmaceutical dependency competed with political scandals, economic news, and entertainment coverage. Even well-documented investigations often generated brief attention before being displaced by newer stories. The media environment that made investigation more difficult through information overload also made exposure less consequential by ensuring few stories received sustained coverage necessary to drive meaningful reform. The motif had transformed from information to disinformation. What began as institutional discretion about embarrassing truths had evolved into sophisticated systems for actively shaping narrative and controlling public perception. The press release that once provided straightforward information had become an instrument of strategic deception, carefully crafted to conceal as much as it revealed. The transformation reflected broader evolution, where information control became central governmental function, requiring professional management and continuous innovation to stay ahead of media scrutiny and public awareness. By the early 2000s, declassification schedules that governed presidential records began releasing documents that confirmed what observers had suspected for decades. The declassified presidential medical files that historians accessed revealed systematic pharmaceutical dependency, aggressive prescribing practices, and medical decisions that prioritized political image over patient health. The files documented everything that institutional protection had concealed: the daily drug doses, the dependency that developed, the medical judgment subordinated to political necessity, and the physicians who enabled dysfunction rather than treating it. The Freedom of Information Act, releases that followed standard declassification schedules after 25 or 50 years, brought documents into public archives that would have generated enormous scandals if disclosed contemporaneously. Presidential medical records showing chronic painkiller use. White House medical unit logs documenting controlled substance prescriptions that exceeded legitimate medical need. Pharmaceutical company correspondence revealing cooperation in suppressing information about side effects. The documents told story of systemic dysfunction that everyone involved had worked to conceal, but nobody could ultimately destroy. Historical Society document dumps that accompanied major anniversaries made available correspondence, memoirs, and internal records that provided context for the medical files. Physicians' private letters acknowledging ethical compromises their positions required. Officials' diaries describing pharmaceutical dependency they couldn't acknowledge publicly. Party operatives' memos outlining strategies for concealing health problems that might undermine campaigns. The accumulated documentation created a comprehensive picture of how presidential medical protection had operated for generations. The archivists who processed these documents understood they were handling historically significant material that contradicted official narratives. Their careful cataloging and description made the documents accessible to researchers who would use them to write histories that challenged the version of events that administrations had carefully constructed. The archivists weren't activists seeking to expose wrongdoing. They were professionals following standard procedures for making historical records available. But their routine work undermined decades of institutional protection simply by making facts accessible to anyone willing to examine them. The historians who broke stories from declassified material faced challenge of making old scandals seem relevant to contemporary audiences. Presidential pharmaceutical dependency from the 1960s generated academic interest but limited public attention. The systematic deception that characterized White House medical practices seemed like historical curiosity rather than ongoing problem. The time delay between events and disclosure ensured that everyone directly responsible was beyond accountability, retired, deceased, or sufficiently removed from power that exposure carried no practical consequences. The declassification dates themselves, 25 to 50 years after events, ensured that truth emerged only when powerless. Presidents whose health records revealed troubling pharmaceutical dependency were long out of office. Physicians whose prescribing patterns suggested malpractice were beyond professional discipline, and officials whose judgment was compromised by dependency faced no consequences because the system that revealed their impairment operated on schedule that guaranteed no accountability would result. The truth emerged, but it emerged too late to matter. The 25-year and 50-year declassification schedules represented compromise between historical transparency and political protection. The schedules acknowledged that eventually truth should be available while ensuring sufficient delay that disclosure wouldn't threaten active careers or ongoing political interests. The compromise satisfied historians' desire for access while protecting institutional secrecy during periods when exposure might generate consequences. Everyone involved understood the arrangement. The truth would eventually surface, but only after everyone responsible had moved beyond vulnerability. The specific examples that declassified files revealed were often more disturbing than researchers expected. Presidential medical records showing morphine prescriptions that continued for years. White House physician correspondence acknowledging that aggressive prescribing was medically questionable but politically necessary. Cabinet officials receiving prescriptions from multiple doctors without coordination that might prevent dangerous drug interactions. The files documented not isolated incidents, but systematic patterns that pervaded executive branch medical care for generations. The Freedom of Information Act requests that historians filed seeking access to more recent records often received responses claiming documents remained classified for national security reasons or were protected by privacy exemptions. The pattern suggested that institutional protection continued even for historical records, that the declassification schedules were less automatic than they appeared, and that sensitive documents could be withheld indefinitely through claims that might or might not withstand legal challenge. But effectively prevented disclosure through the time and expense required to litigate access. The investigative journalists who used declassified documents to reconstruct historical scandals faced editorial challenge of maintaining reader interest in events that occurred decades earlier. Stories about JFK's amphetamine injections or Reagan's painkiller dependency generated attention but competed with current political news. The historical expos served primarily to establish patterns and context, rather than drive immediate reform. They proved that presidential pharmaceutical dependency wasn't new problem, but long-standing pattern, information that was historically valuable, but practically limited in its capacity to generate change. The pattern recognition that emerged from comprehensive document review revealed how consistent the dysfunction had been. Different administrations, different physicians, different specific drugs, but the same basic pattern repeated across generations. Aggressive prescribing that prioritized function over safety. Institutional protection that concealed dependency from scrutiny, and medical judgment subordinated to political necessity, regardless of which party controlled the White House. The consistency suggested systemic rather than individual problem, institutional culture rather than personal failing, which raises an uncomfortable question. If declassified documents consistently revealed pharmaceutical dependency, medical deception, and impaired judgment among the nation's highest officials, what did current practices look like? The files being declassified in the 2000s documented 1950s through 1980s practices. The assumption that recent decades were fundamentally different required believing that institutional culture had transformed completely despite no visible reforms, no public accounting, and no evidence that the pressures creating dysfunction had diminished. The declassification process itself became subject of scrutiny as researchers discovered documents that should have been released, but remained classified. Records that were released with extensive redactions that concealed crucial details, and materials that were simply missing from archives where they should have been preserved. The gaps suggested ongoing information control even for historical records, that institutional protection extended beyond active cover-up to include careful management of which truths would eventually become accessible and which would remain concealed indefinitely. The historians and journalists who worked with declassified presidential medical records understood they were documenting systemic failure that the nation had chosen not to confront when consequences might have resulted. The truth emerged when it was historically interesting but practically irrelevant. The deceased presidents, whose pharmaceutical dependency was now documented, faced no consequences. The retired physicians, whose malpractice was now evident, faced no discipline. And the institutions that had enabled dysfunction for generations continued operating under the same assumptions, protected by the same discretion, serving officials who presumably faced the same pressures that had created dependency in earlier generations. The motif had transformed from burial to resurrection, but resurrection into harmless historical curiosity. The archive boxes that once protected secrets by keeping them locked away now released those secrets into scholarly examination that changed nothing. The documents confirmed what many suspected, revealed details that shocked researchers, and established patterns that proved systematic dysfunction, but they arrived too late to generate accountability, influence policy, or protect current officials from repeating the same patterns that earlier generations had concealed. The truth had become available precisely when it ceased to matter. A victory for historical transparency that left contemporary practice entirely unchanged. By the 2010s, the White House medical unit structure remained fundamentally unchanged despite decades of exposures. The organizational chart looked remarkably similar to what had existed in the 1970s. A White House physician, supporting medical staff, and protocols that prioritized presidential function over conventional medical ethics. The recent presidential physicians whose names appeared in public records operated under the same institutional assumptions that had governed their predecessors. Discretion was paramount, political necessity trumped medical judgment, and pharmaceutical solutions to performance demands were routine. rather than exceptional. The current White House medical unit structure that researchers could document through public records and occasional press coverage maintained the same dual function that had characterized presidential medicine for generations. Publicly, it provided routine health care to the first family and senior staff. Privately, it managed the gap between human limitations and institutional demands through pharmaceutical interventions that conventional medical practice would question. The structure had been refined, the documentation had become more sophisticated, but the fundamental approach remained unchanged. Modern pharmaceutical prescribing patterns that occasionally surfaced through investigative journalism suggested continuity rather than reform. Senior officials still received prescriptions for controlled substances with minimal oversight. The medications prescribed, painkillers, anti-anxiety drugs, sleeping pills, stimulants, remain the same categories that had characterized presidential pharmaceutical use for decades. The specific drugs had evolved as pharmaceutical science advanced, but the underlying pattern of using medications to push officials beyond natural human capacity persisted unchanged. The unchanged protocols that governed presidential medical care reflected institutional choice rather than oversight failure. Congress had authority to mandate transparency around presidential health. Professional medical associations could establish ethical standards specific to government medicine. And public pressure following repeated exposures could have driven reform. None of these things happened because the system worked exactly as designed, protecting official image, enabling continued function despite impairment, and ensuring that political considerations dominated medical decisions whenever the two conflicted. Nothing legally required disclosure of presidential pharmaceutical use. The privacy protections that applied to ordinary patients extended to presidents, and the political incentives that might have driven voluntary transparency didn't exist. Administrations that disclosed health problems faced political damage. Officials who acknowledged pharmaceutical dependency risked career destruction, and the physicians who might have insisted on transparency understood that doing so would cost them their positions without changing the system they served. The lack of legal requirement, combined with strong incentives for secrecy, ensured that the protection machinery continued operating indefinitely. The protection machinery that had evolved over more than a century had become so embedded in institutional culture that reform seemed almost inconceivable. Every administration inherited the same medical unit structure, the same protocols, the same assumptions about what presidential medicine required. The physicians who served in these roles were selected partly for their willingness to accommodate these realities, and the officials they treated understood that questioning the system might generate personal transparency they desperately wanted to avoid. The mutual complicity made change impossible without external pressure that never materialized. So what did we learn? That presidential vices, pharmaceutical, alcoholic, and financial, operated in darkness for 2 centuries, not because of individual moral failure, but because of systematic institutional protection. That the physicians, party operatives, journalists, and officials who maintained this secrecy believed they were serving national interest by concealing weakness that might undermine confidence. That exposure, when it occasionally occurred, generated brief attention before institutional protection reasserted itself stronger than before. And that the declassification schedule that eventually revealed truth operated on timeline that guaranteed accountability would never result. The medical bag that had symbolized discretion in the 1860s remained closed in the 2010s, still making its rounds through the White House, still containing secrets that would be revealed decades later when revelation carried no consequences. The system had survived scandal, investigation, exposure, and reform because everyone involved benefited from its continuation, or believed they did, which amounted to the same thing. The comfortable lie that Americans had accepted about presidential health reflected broader understanding about power's requirements. Public polling on presidential transparency showed citizens claiming to want honesty while consistently punishing officials who provided it. The contradiction revealed that the discretion system provided wasn't just protecting officials, It was protecting public preference for leaders who appeared invulnerable even when that appearance required systematic deception. The lie was comfortable because acknowledging the truth would require confronting how much of political legitimacy rested on carefully maintained fiction. Constitutional scholars who examined presidential health disclosure requirements found the law deliberately vague. The 25th Amendment addressed presidential disability, but left determining inability to discharge powers and duties to political judgment rather than medical assessment. The constitutional ambiguity wasn't drafting failure, it was intentional choice to avoid mandating transparency that might generate more problems than it solved. The legal framework reflected national preference for flexibility over accountability, allowing each administration to manage health issues according to political calculation rather than medical necessity. Medical ethicists who studied government medicine described unique ethical challenges that conventional medical practice didn't address. Should physicians prioritize individual patient welfare when that patient's impairment might affect millions? How should doctors balance confidentiality obligations against public safety concerns? The questions had no clear answers because they required choosing between competing goods, patient privacy versus public welfare, medical ethics versus political stability, individual rights versus collective interest. The ethicists generally concluded that government physicians faced impossible situations where any choice involved ethical compromise. The comparison to other democracies' transparency requirements revealed American exceptionalism around presidential health. Parliamentary systems where prime ministers could be replaced quickly had less need for health disclosure. But other presidential systems often mandated regular medical assessments and public reporting that U.S. practice avoided. The American approach prioritized stability and image over transparency, accepting that the cost of continuity included concealing impairments that might trigger constitutional crises if acknowledged. The system had worked as designed for more than 2 centuries, protecting presidential image through pharmaceutical assistance, media cooperation, and institutional discretion that made official dysfunction invisible until decades after it mattered. The cost was presidents whose judgment was compromised by dependency, officials whose impairment affected policy decisions, and physicians whose medical ethics were subordinated to political necessity. But these costs were carefully concealed, revealed only in declassified documents that arrived too late to generate accountability, emerging as historical curiosities rather than urgent problems requiring reform. We chose discretion over disclosure, decided that presidential image mattered more than medical transparency, and accepted that the gap between public vigor and private pharmaceutical dependency could be managed indefinitely through institutions designed to conceal rather than reveal. The choice wasn't made explicitly through democratic deliberation. It emerged gradually through countless small decisions to protect rather than expose, to accommodate rather than reform, to accept dysfunction as normal cost of maintaining governmental continuity. By the time the pattern became clear, it was too deeply embedded to change without confronting realities everyone involved preferred to ignore. The physician's bag continued making its rounds, still carrying secrets that would eventually surface, but only after everyone responsible had moved beyond accountability. The system hummed along, protecting officials through pharmaceutical intervention and institutional discretion, operating exactly as it had for generations. And Americans slept comfortably, preferring convenient fiction to uncomfortable truth. Accepting that their leader's apparent vigor might be chemically assisted, but finding that reality easier to ignore than confront. The same White House medical office that Dr. Robert Stone had established in 1869 still operates today. Different century, but same essential purpose. The black leather physician's bag has been replaced by modern medical equipment, but the fundamental function remains unchanged, managing the gap between human limitation and political necessity through pharmaceutical intervention and institutional discretion. The morphine that Grant's doctor prescribed has given way to sophisticated pharmaceutical cocktails. But the dependency being managed differs in specifics rather than substance. The machine hums along, surprisingly resilient for something built on deception and compromise. It adapts to new technologies, incorporates lessons from each exposure, and rebuilds protection stronger after every temporary disruption. The secrets stay secrets, protected by privacy claims, professional ethics, institutional culture, and mutual complicity among everyone involved. The declassification schedule ensures that truth will eventually emerge, but always decades too late to matter, always after everyone responsible has moved beyond accountability. And somehow, we all sleep just fine. Perhaps because we've accepted that power requires the comfortable lies we've been telling ourselves for 2 centuries. That presidents are healthier than regular people despite facing extraordinary stress. That pharmaceutical assistance is just medical care rather than performance enhancement. That the physicians, journalists, and officials who maintain this system for generations were protecting national interest rather than enabling dysfunction. The lies are comfortable because the alternative, confronting how much of American governance has operated under chemically managed impairment, might require accountability that we've consistently chosen to avoid. If you made it this far tonight, you've stayed with me through 2 centuries of institutional deception, pharmaceutical dependency, and carefully maintained secrets that shaped American power in ways the textbooks never acknowledged. Thank you for listening while the rest of the world sleeps. Next time, we'll explore another quietly erased scandal, the forgotten black site programs that operated for decades before a single document was declassified. Until then, sleep well. The machine will still be running in the morning.